Welcome everybody to another episode here of history. So sometimes history is made out of the big characters who start wars, who make conquests, or characters that achieve something important, something pivotal for humanity, like saving a population or even destroying one. Sometimes, though, it's not cut and dry which characters are in front of our eyes. Even if history is made out of different big men or women that shape its course, sometimes these characters are in the shade. They work behind closed doors and they work in the dark. They're mystery people, they're spies. And these people can change the course of history from behind the curtains. And sometimes we're working for a country to carry on their interest, or working for two countries, or even fooling three countries. Who knows? These things have really happened. And today that's what we're going to focus on. I had really great time working on this episode, and I really hope you guys enjoy it. And if you like this content, subscribe and click the bell so you'll be notified of when the next episode comes out. But let's start with this episode here. I'm really excited. So we are in Tokyo in the summer of 1935. Let's take a moment to put things into perspective. We are between two world wars. The first is already fading into the past, while the second is drawing very close, with the world already spiraling toward World War II. It's the summer of 1935 in Tokyo. In Italy, Mussolini is at the peak of its popularity. In Germany, there is Hitler. In the Soviet Union, Stalin. And in the United States, Roosevelt. And as the end of the Great Depression begins to come into sight. In Japan, events are unfolding that seem very strange. Events that seem very strange to Western eyes. So one day in July 1935, a certain Lieutenant Colonel Aizawa arrives in Tokyo by train from the town where he is stationed. He goes to the Ministry of War, finds the office of a ministry official, General Nagata. He enters inside the office, he draws his katana and kills General Nagata. At the trial, Lieutenant Colonel Aizawa will say that he is ashamed of only one thing, not having managed to kill him with a single blow as a well-trained samurai should do. During the trial, it becomes clear that this murder in the Japanese Ministry of War is not a personal matter, but is connected to a conflict that is dividing the Japanese army. There is a conflict between the older, moderate generals in power who are tied to Japan majors, industrial and financial conglomerates, and a whole generation of young officers, often of rural or otherwise modest origins, who are extremists with strong fascist sympathies. In Japan, there is a tradition of conflict of this kind. There is a Japanese term dating back to the 15th century that is known as gekokujo, that means the overthrow of elders by the young. Young officers are restless and eager to seize power. The trial of Lieutenant Colonel Aizawa for murder lasts many months, and during this time, one day in February 1936, a group of young officers leads soldiers out of their barracks and occupy the Ministry of War, the Parliament, and the police headquarters, and attacks the homes of the Prime Minister and several ministers. Two ministers are killed in their homes. The Prime Minister survives only because the young officers who break into his house mistake his brother-in-law for him and kill the brother-in-law instead. Afterward, the rebellious young officers declare that they have taken action out of a sense of duty toward the emperor, and do nothing more as if expecting Emperor Hirohito to intervene in their favor. For 2 days, the government negotiates with the rebels, almost as if recognizing them as a legitimate counterpart. Meanwhile, it has all occupied buildings surrounded by troops, mainly by naval forces. Everyone knows that in Japan, the army and the navy despise each other. After 3 days, the rebels surrender. Most are tried, sentenced to death, and executed. Western governments, on the other side, are struggling to understand what is happening. What is going on in Japan at that moment is entirely unclear to them. No one understands it. So Japan is a distant, complex country, and no one knows the language. It's an impenetrable nation that communicates very little with the outside world, and there are few, if any, specialists in the West who understand the internal dynamics of the society in crisis. Even the European journalists in Tokyo, who are already few in number, are fumbling in the dark. There is only one journalist who is able to explain what is happening, a German journalist accredited in Tokyo for a couple of years, a member of the Nazi Party with excellent relations with his embassy, and who has an unusually deep knowledge of Japanese politics. After the uprising of the young officers, this journalist publishes a major article in Germany from Tokyo, in which he effectively explains these complicated dynamics. There is a class and generational struggle within the Japanese army. The article is a huge success and is reproduced worldwide. Even the Pravda in Moscow translates it and into Russian. The journalist's friends congratulate him by telling him, "You really become famous all over the world, even for those communists in Moscow." The journalist laughs, but deep down he is furious. That evening he goes to visit another small German industrialist settled in Tokyo and in an industrial suburb of Tokyo. In his home, he keeps a hidden radio transmitter that is capable of broadcasting all the way to Siberia, from where the transmission is then received and sent to Moscow. The journalist calls Moscow and says, "You must be out of your mind publishing my articles in the Pravda. Don't let that happen again, because no one must suspect of me as connected with the Soviet Union." So the journalist's name was Richard Sorge. He has been a member of the Communist Party since 1918 and was the head of the spy network placed in Tokyo by the Soviet Red Army's intelligence service. It was a network of spies that among many intelligence groups operated during World War II. It is perhaps the one that most directly influenced the outcome of the Second World War. Richard Sorge was the son of a German engineer and a Russian mother. In high school in Berlin, he was first in his class in all subjects. One of those students that would say, let's say, were generally not very liked by their classmates. His classmates had nicknamed him the Prime Minister. However, like a young German student of his generation, born at the end of the 19th century, he was a good German patriot. When World War I broke out, he enlisted as a volunteer and spent 4 years fighting on the front. He was wounded 3 times in the legs and, in the end, very seriously, which left him with a slight limp for the rest of his life. Like many others during the war, Richard Sorge had changed. He had met people he would never have met before as a bourgeois young man. He met pacifists, social democrats, communists, and he had become a communist himself. Perhaps the fact that he had lost 2 brothers in the war played a part in guiding him in that direction. In any case, right after the end of the war, Richard, at 20, joined the Communist Party. The following year, he graduated in political science, and from then on, he would be known as Dr. Sorge. By this point, he was already on the German police list as a communist agitator. I emphasize this point because, as we will see shortly, 10 years later, the German police had completely forgotten about him. The German police were not always as efficient as we might imagine, and in this case is a particularly striking example. They had lost track of his life, even though they knew full well that in 1920 that young Dr. Sorge was a communist. While the Germans forgot about him, the Soviets took notice. At one point, he even spoke Russian, thanks to his ties to his mother, his Russian mother. Eventually, they invite him to Moscow to work for the Comintern, the Communist International, founded in 1919 by the Soviet Union, aimed to unite communist parties worldwide. spreading Marxist and Leninist ideology under Soviet leadership and support revolutionary movements in other countries. But in 1943, during World War II, Joseph Stalin dissolved it due to his unions, his allies against Nazi Germany. And in 1925, at the age of 29, Dr. Sorge leaves Germany and settles in Moscow. At first, he stays at the famous Hotel Lux, the hotel reserved for foreign communists, where many people who later met a tragic fate once stayed. That same year, he acquires Soviet citizenship and joins the Soviet Communist Party. He brings along his wife, Christiane, a German woman who had been married to one of his university's professors, but left him to be with Richard. However, things don't go well in the Soviet Union, and Christiane doesn't like it there, and eventually she leaves him and returns to Germany. Christiane exits our story, but I wanted to mention her because she left a comment about Richard Sorge that is very instructive. Many years later, Christiane was asked about her affair with her husband's student and how he had seduced her. She refers to him as the diminutive name of Ricard, as a child. When he was learning to speak, he had difficulty pronouncing his name, and instead of saying Ricard, he said Ika. So in the family, they always called him Ika. Christiane says, no, he didn't seduce me. I was the one who fell in love with him. Ika didn't need to court anyone. Everyone flocked around him, both men and women. Then, in the 1920s, the man who was admired by everyone and fascinated all those around him is sent on several missions abroad on behalf of the Comintern. Among the dock workers in Scandinavia, among the miners in England, and then in 1929 his fate changes. He's summoned to the office of General Jan Karlovich Berdzin, commander of the 4th Section of the Soviet Red Army's intelligence service, the section responsible for creating networks of agents abroad. General Berdzin proposed to Dr. Sorge that he set up a network of spies in China, in Shanghai. In 1929, China is a country in turmoil. In theory, Chiang Kai-shek is in control, but in reality, much of the country is in the hands of warlords. There is a powerful underground communist movement, and the Japanese are on the borders waiting for the right moment to begin their invasion of China. Moscow urgently needed information about China, but had no official channels to gather it. There was no Soviet consulate in China, and Shanghai was notorious for executing any communists it captured. In response, General Berdzin suggested that Sorge travel to China to assess whether it would be possible to establish a network of communist spies. Dr. Sorge agrees and went to China, posing as a journalist intending to write reports, something he actually did. He settled in Shanghai, a city that was technically under Chinese sovereignty, but was largely governed by foreign powers, with different Western countries controlling various districts. The French, in particular, controlled a large concession, patrolled by their own police, while the Japanese posed a constant threat just outside the city, frequently threatening to invade. In Shanghai, Dr. Sorge immersed himself in a fascinating and complex world populated by clandestine communists, wealthy industrialists, and Western financiers. The city offered a unique blend of Western lifestyle with restaurants and German bookstores, creating a cosmopolitan atmosphere. Sorge spent 3 years in this environment, during which he sent insightful analytical articles about the Chinese situation back to Germany. He also established himself as a leading expert on East Asia while providing Moscow with a wealth of information. He was sort of a double agent in this case. In 1932, Sorge returned to Moscow, where he was warmly welcomed with handshakes and asked, "Are you ready to go on another mission?" Dr. Sorge, however, replied that he would first like to finish writing his book on Chinese agriculture he had started. He explained that he was someone who took genuine interest in things and had the soul of a scholar. In reality, he holds a degree in political science. He's an economist. But when he is in a country, he starts studying. He is writing a book on Chinese agriculture and asks to be left in peace until he finishes it. General Jan Karlovich Benzin says, "All right, you must finish the book, then do so." But after 2 months, they call him back and ask, "Is the book finished?" The book is not finished. The Soviet Military Intelligence Service was eager to send Dr. Sorge on another mission, so they asked, "What should we send you next?" And Sorge joked, saying, "I've been to China. I could go to Japan. While I was in Shanghai, I took a little trip to Tokyo. I liked it. It's an interesting country. I could go back if you really insist." But he was just joking. A few days later, General Benzin called him back and told him that he had shared Sorge's remark with the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, and they had taken it very seriously. They were in desperate need of agents in Tokyo. Keep in mind what kind of unique country was Japan at the time. It was a very opaque and impenetrable country for Westerners, openly xenophobic, and with a maniacal obsession with spies. Every foreigner was followed by the police, and often by more than one police force. There were several secret police forces, like the Kempeitai, the military police of the Imperial Japanese Army. Their main role was law enforcement and maintaining military discipline. They also acted as a secret police force, heavily involved in intelligence gathering and counterintelligence during wartime. The Kempeitai were infamous for their brutal methods and extensive surveillance, operating both in Japan and in occupied territories, often resorting to torture and harsh methods. In Japan, they also had the Tokeitai, or also called the Tokko, or special hire police, a secret police force specifically for military intelligence with the Japanese army, operating under the Imperial Army's general staff. The Tokeitai was responsible for intelligence gathering, covert operation, and espionage activities, spying on foreign governments and tracking down suspected spies and resistance groups. It is a fiercely anti-communist country, and it borders the Soviet Union. To put things in context, the Russo-Japanese War of 1905 had ended less than 30 years earlier. Although it might seem like a distant event, it was still fresh in their minds, in the minds of both nations. In that war, Japan defeated Russia and gained the control of territories such as Korea and parts of Manchuria. The Japanese were firmly established in these regions and shared a border with the Soviet Union. In Manchuria, the powerful Kwantung Army acted almost as an independent force, pursuing its own policies toward China and the Soviet Union, while barely obeying the Japanese government. They were a Japanese army. But it was pretty much independent at this point. It was a time where if generals grew tired of their prime ministers, they would have killed them. They would have him killed. Moscow was desperate to know what Japan was planning, but no one could figure it out. They needed to understand the mood of the Kwantung Army, whether the border between Mongolia and Manchuria was at risk. In Japan, there were no agents for the Soviet Union to make sure that the Kwantung Army wouldn't, to check how they would act. But no one knew if a communist radio transmitter between Japan and the Soviet Union could ever work, because in order to establish communications or even to establish a network of agents, or if it were possible to recruit Japanese communists and convince them to work for the Soviet cause. They knew nothing. At this point, Dr. Sorge was asked by his superiors, "Look, we need to try an experiment. If you're willing, go there, stay for a couple of years and see if it's possible." The idea intrigued Dr. Sorge and fascinated him. So the plan is to send Dr. Sorge from Moscow to Tokyo, a fiercely anti-communist country with no diplomatic ties to the Soviet Union. Sorge is a man with a very clear principle. The fewer lies, the better. the less likely he is to be discovered, the better. So, if possible, he avoids lying altogether. As a result, he will go to Tokyo as Dr. Richard Sorge, using his real name, an expert journalist on the Far East. The only small detail is that he cannot travel directly from Russia, so he returns to Berlin in May 1933. Notice the timing. Hitler was only been in power for a few months, but diplomatic relations between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany still exist. Both countries are considered pariahs of the international community at this point, and thus they maintain relations. In this context, Sorge can return to Berlin. Once there, he applies for a passport to Japan, and already accustomed to writing articles on the Far East, he visits several German newspapers to offer them reports from Tokyo. So he finds several newspapers interested, and he also does something else. In Germany at the time, there was a curious, well-known figure, Professor Karl Haushofer. He was a world-renowned expert in geopolitics and strategy, and highly respected in Germany. Haushofer has also been a military officer during World War I, where he achieved the rank of general, although his role was not primarily in combat command. After the war, he shifted his focus to academia and had become an expert on Japan. His influence grew, especially with his theories on territorial expansion, which would later impact Nazi ideology. Dr. Haushofer had been in Japan as an instructor for the German army, and he argued that Germany's defeat in World War I was due to the Germans' ignorance on the global stage, on the geopolitical situation. During World War I, Germany and Japan had been enemies. Haushofer theorized that in the future, Germany and Japan must unite, as only by doing so could they succeed. However, these were not just the theories of an academic. As it happened, Professor Haushofer was a close friend of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, and through this connection, he was able to directly influence the policies of Nazi Germany. One could give an entire lecture on Professor Haushofer, and I'll make here a brief digression because he's such a fascinating figure. He is a staunch German patriot who dreams of revenge. A small problem to Professor Haushofer is that his wife was half Jewish, but being a close friend to Rudolf Hess, he was able to secure an Aryan certificate for his wife and children, which protected them, or almost. The story, though tragic, is also captivating. A few years later, in 1944, one of Haushofer's sons, a young officer, will be involved in the June 20th assassination attempt on Hitler and executed. In 1945, after Germany's defeat, Professor Haushofer and his half-Jewish wife would both commit suicide by poisoning themselves with arsenic. We're still far from that moment, 11 years to go, but it's 1933, and the young and brilliant journalist Dr. Sorge travels to Munich to visit the renowned Professor Haushofer. He explains that he's heading to Tokyo and asks if Haushofer would be interested in helping him. The professor is indeed interested and agrees to provide him with letters of introduction. And since he knows everyone, Sorge will leave Berlin with letters of recommendation from this prominent Nazi intellectual, addressed to the German ambassador in Tokyo. But that's really not all, since traveling to Japan at that time required going to ship passing through the United States. The journey will take some time, and Sorge will make a stop in the US for a while. The professor then asks, would you be interested in letters of introduction for the Japanese ambassador in Washington? Dr. Sorge, of course, is interested, so the Soviet spy sets off from Berlin with letters of introduction from prominent Nazi figures for all the destinations he might need. However, he is a bit more concerned about the passport, as it means going to the police. And as I mentioned earlier, 10 years prior, the police had already categorized Richard Sorge as a communist. Despite this, Sorge decides to take the risk and goes to the Berlin police. And to his surprise, they don't know who he is, and they give him the passport without any issues. Now, the regime has only just been established, and the Gestapo is still in its early stages. Clearly, they issued a passport for Japan without any trouble. The young communist agitator no longer exists. Under the same name, there is now a well-known German journalist heading to Tokyo. Before he departs, his application to join the Nazi party is so confident that upon arriving in Tokyo, he sends his first message to Moscow saying, "I believe I can fool them all." And indeed he does. No one deceives them more thoroughly than the German embassy. To the situation, it's 1933. And we're used to thinking about the alliance between Germany and Japan, the Pact of Steel, and later the inclusion of Italy in the Rome-Berlin-Tokyo axis, which still haunts Italy to this day, always siding with the losers. But in 1933, none of this existed yet. For the Japanese, Germany was just another European country that was hostile to them. They had been enemies during World War I. Imagine the German diplomats in Tokyo living in a country they barely understand. It's 1933. Hitler and the Nazi Party have just come to power in Germany. These career diplomats are in Tokyo, and they're all Nazis. And far from it, they're in Tokyo trying to figure out what's happening back home. Then, as if dropped by the sky, they received this incredible gift, a wonderful, charming compatriot, well-connected, well-informed, who arrives telling them everything they want to know, and who even knows a lot more about Japan than the German diplomats themselves. They adore him, asking if he needs any help. But Sorge, just as his wife, as Ika, they will call him, as his wife Ika would say, doesn't need to ask for anything. They'll go to him and ask, "Do you have letters of introduction for the Japanese government?" "No, I already have them," Sorge replies. "How did you get them?" "I went to the Japanese embassy in Washington and they gave them to me." The German diplomat's eyes widen in amazement. Wow, who's this guy? Here is an extraordinary man, someone they must keep close. Dr. Sorge is also fortunate, as one of his contacts happens to be Colonel Ott, a German instructor for the Japanese army. Imagine Colonel Ott and his wife living in a provincial Japanese town where they hardly know anyone and are somewhat isolated. Then Sorge arrives from Berlin, cheerful, famous, wealthy, and immensely charming, as they become instant friends. It was never confirmed, even at the trial, whether there was a romantic involvement between Dr. Sorge and Colonel Ott's wife. But they certainly became close friends. The two men, both veterans, bond over chess and shared experiences, forming a deep friendship. And why do I say that Dr. Sorge is lucky? 6 months later, Colonel Ott is promoted and transferred to Tokyo. In Tokyo, Ott becomes a military attaché at the German embassy. A few years later, the German ambassador to Tokyo is transferred to Berlin, to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Lacking any Japan experts, they replace him with Colonel Ott, who becomes the new German ambassador to Tokyo. His closest and most loyal friend is Dr. Sorge. In the following years, Sorge and the ambassador's intimate friend moves in and out of the embassy as if it were its own home. When Colonel Ott needs to cipher a particularly complex dispatch, he asks his friend Dr. Sorge to help. When he needs to revise a report for Berlin, he asks if Sorge can assist with writing it. When confidential documents arrive, Ott says, "Would you like to take a look too?" "Of course," replies Sorge. And in the meantime, at home, Sorge photographs the documents. At one point, Ambassador Ott offers Dr. Sorge the position of the head of the press office at the embassy. This is the one time Sorge reacts somewhat unusually, really strange, because he knows that accepting such an official role would require notifying the ministry in Berlin, and if the ministry gets involved, they might start investigating his past more closely. This prospect makes him uncomfortable, so he tells Ambassador Ott that he isn't interested in taking an official position. However, he assures him that he will continue to assist with secret dispatches, and just as he has done all along. Ott is a little disappointed, but he respects Sorge's decision. However, he eventually comes to terms with it. In the end, the moral of the story is that one of the primary sources of information for the Soviet spy Richard Sorge throughout those years is the German embassy in Tokyo itself, where he feels completely at home and can observe everything. He wins the affection of the embassy's diplomats, partly because of his extraordinary political skill. As we mentioned, Sorge applied to join the Nazi Party, and indeed his membership card regularly arrives in Tokyo. There is something quite striking about this, which illustrates how the Nazi Party was in Berlin. They found Sorge's party registration card in their archives, filed under overseas residence. All it says is name Richard Sorge, residence Tokyo, China. Then in pencil, someone drew a line through China and wrote Japan instead. That's all the Nazi Party knew about their new member, but in Tokyo. And Dr. Sorge is a very skillful man. He understands that the German diplomats are not fanatical Nazis. He plays the part of a Nazi, but with humor and a critical edge, often making jokes that allows him to move freely among them. The diplomats absolutely love him. At one point, the Nazi group in Tokyo proposes making Sorge the director of the section. He discusses it with Ambassador Ott, who jokingly says, well, every now and then a little common sense would be good in the party, but Sorge ultimately declines again the position because, as always, he prefers to keep his role more flexible. Then there is the network, Sorge's network of Japanese agents. This is important to understand because Sorge relies on Japanese agents. Modern espionage as we know it often involves much of than just stealing secret documents by breaking into safes or cracking codes. It also depends on gathering intelligence through a network of reliable agents and informants. Espionage even today largely involves working with what are known as in the field as open sources, which means that newspapers publish a wealth of information. Newspapers, specialized magazines, company reports, these are all public documents, but it requires an immense amount of work to read through everything, to compare, cross-check, and analyze. Any network of informants must do the same, extending and verifying information from these public sources. In Japan, during the 1930s, even just working with open sources is not easy. So first of all, no one really knows Japanese well, not even Sorge, who learns a bit of it. But it's not all. Japan, as I mentioned, is a country obsessed with spies, where foreigners are constantly monitored and watched. Foreigners, in fact, are forbidden from buying books or magazines that discuss Japan's internal issues. If a foreigner shows any interest in these publications, it is the duty of the bookstore owner to report them to the police. As a result, even gathering information that is publicly available, accessible to Japanese citizens, is difficult for foreigners. So for Sorge is a real network. They need a real network of Japanese people. So during these 3 years in Shanghai, Sorge met several Japanese individuals in his past experience, some of whom were communists. He had initially contacted them under a false identity, and it was later confirmed that they were willing to support the communist cause. Sorge re-established contacts with these individuals after arriving in Japan. Spies use covert methods to exchange information in public spaces, such as dead drop, brush passes, and clandestine meetings. A dead drop involves leaving information in a hidden spot for another agent to retrieve. A brush pass is a quick, casual exchange of materials between agents without speaking. And a clandestine meeting is a secretive rendezvous in a public place where agents meet briefly to exchange information unnoticed. These techniques help maintain secrecy and avoid detection. In this way, Sorge reconnects with people he had met previously. Among them, one becomes especially significant, a sort of alter ego to Sorge, playing a major role even during the subsequent trial. This person is called Ozaki. Ozaki is a renowned journalist for Japan's largest newspaper, Asahi Shimbun. An expert on China, Ozaki is deeply embedded in Japan's political circles with connections to ministers and prime ministers. Eventually, he is even appointed as an official consultant to the Japanese government on Chinese affairs. Earlier, I mentioned the Kwantung Army, the Japanese military in Manchuria, which operates almost independently and poses the main threat to the Soviet Union borders. At one point, Ozaki is appointed head of the press office for the South Manchurian Railway, a major trust closely tied to the Japanese military. This position puts him in direct contact with the army's decision-making processes. Now, Ozaki secretly is a communist, even though he is well known and a respected figure in Japan. When he was approached, he confirmed his willingness to work for the Comintern and provide information. Other Japanese communists were also identified within those circles. Equally intriguing, though, was the world of Japanese immigrants in the United States, especially in California, where a large Japanese community had settled during the 1920s and 1930s. The Communist Party was active in the US, though it would later be weakened by World War II and especially McCarthyism. In those earlier years, however, its influence was considerable, and many Japanese immigrants joined the communist cause. Moscow's agent reached out to these individuals, recruiting those willing to work for communism. Several agreed, and upon returning to Japan, they were connected with Dr. Sorge's network. Sorge will eventually have many agents, all of whom act out of pure ideological conviction. There is little money involved, and the risks are enormous. Yet, until the end, none of them will betray him. Remarkably, Sorge is living openly in Japan at this point and technically isn't violating any Japanese laws. Although secretly photocopying confidential German embassy documents could be seen as troubling, it doesn't actually break any specific Japanese law. In fact, when Sorge is eventually arrested, the authorities will face difficulty finding a clear legal basis for prosecution. Only one law will apply around this time. Japan introduces a new statute imposing the death penalty on anyone transmitting information and to a communist country. This law ultimately enables the Japanese authorities to convict Sorge, even though his main activities involve gathering information rather than acts of espionage. Now, information can be sent by courier using microfilm. Typically, a courier travels to Shanghai, where large hotels often offer convenient, discreet locations for meetings. These encounters resemble scenes from a spy novel. On a certain date, go to the bar at the Imperial Hotel. Place a yellow book on the right side of your table. Look for someone with a green book on the left side of theirs. Make brief eye contact without exchanging words. That evening, meet on such and such street. While effective, this method of sending microfilm to Shanghai is impractical for daily updates, and of course it has its risks. Meanwhile, Moscow demands constant updates. With the global situation shifting and war drawing nearer, they need the need for timely information is urgent. This is why radio communication becomes essential, and for that, they need a skilled European technician. The only person Sorge brought with him, or later replaced with someone even more capable, would be crucial to the network, the radio technician. Keep in mind that radio technology was still in its infancy and not something widely mastered. They needed somebody, an expert, a real expert, a wizard, a genius, basically, to make this radio work. And they found him. They recruited him in a manner straight out of a spy novel. His name was Max Clausen, a German from Hamburg, the most left-leaning city in Germany. Max Clausen, a German from Hamburg, had previously served as a radio operator in the German Imperial Army during World War I. After the war, he worked as a radio operator on a fishing vessel in Hamburg. It was there that a Soviet agent approached him, asking if he was still a communist and willing to work for the cause. Max Clausen agreed. They handed him a first-class train ticket to Moscow and a Thomas Mann novel, saying, inside the novel, you'll find your destination. Within the book, certain passages were underlined to form a code, a fairly simpler one. Presumably, they figured if he couldn't crack it, he wasn't right for the job. If he could, the decoded message would reveal the address he needed in Moscow. Clausen successfully deciphered it and arrived in Moscow and reported to the address, where he was promptly hired. He received advanced training as a radio telegraph operator and truly became a wizard. When he was sent to Tokyo, it was because of Sorge, because he was fed up with a previous radio operator who was too fearful to transmit regularly. Clausen and his wife traveled to Tokyo together, as taking a spouse raised fewer suspicions. This was common practice among European members of the network. Max Clausen embarks for Tokyo, carrying all the necessary technical equipment in his suitcase. 2 line valves, along with a model of others. He, of course, needs to source all the additional components to build the radio. Instead of buying them from a radio store, where he might raise suspicion, he purchases them from a light bulb shops around the city. It takes him 3 months to gather all the components. The Soviet intelligence services, as you can see, work over the long term. After 3 months, Clausen has assembled a portable transmitter, one that can be disassembled in 5 minutes and reassembled in 10. He keeps it in a small bag, allowing him to transmit from various locations around the city using different agents' homes without ever being intercepted. Now, naturally, Clausen also needs a cover story. Since he's an industrial worker, they set him up with a business. Max Clausen moves to Tokyo under the guise of a small business owner, opening a company that manufactures specialized machines for photographing the industrial designs. So officially, his business flourishes, generating substantial income and eventually employing 14 people. The success, however, brings complications as Clausen transitions from a worker to small business owner, making money and enjoying his newfound prosperity. He becomes increasingly drawn to the life of the successful industrialist. Over time, this shift distracts him from his espionage duties, though he continues his work until the end. Capitalism is not that bad, even for Max Clausen, he finds out. Then Moscow makes a critical error. With funds running low, they tell him, since Clausen's business is doing well, use his profits. Well, Clausen resents this, creating a classic case of a former proletarian whose allegiance wavers after becoming a businessman. Understandable. Clausen's work overall is going very well. He's an exceptionally skilled radio telegraph operator capable of transmitting securely to the Soviet Union. As the world edges toward war by the summer of 1938, Moscow informs him you can transmit whenever you want during the first 15 minutes of every hour, 24 hours a day. Someone will be tuned into your frequency to check for messages. Dr. Sorge is well known and well liked in Tokyo. Well, he leads a lively social life and fully embraces the local culture. He lives in a traditional Japanese style house with a garden, has a Japanese housekeeper who prepares his meals, and at home he wears a kimono, sleeps on a tatami mat, and bathes daily in a wooden tub. An unusual practice for Europeans at the time, which surprises his German embassy friends. Sorge surrounds himself with books on Japanese history and culture, acquiring them through various means. When he is later arrested, authorities find over 8,000 books on Japan in his home. By day, Sorge is fully integrated into Tokyo social circles, while at night he's often out drinking with his German friends, earning a reputation as a heavy drinker. Tokyo in this era, despite a backdrop of xenophobia and vigilant secret police, also has a variety of Western-style establishments. There are restaurants for foreigners where Japanese waitresses even dye their hair blonde or orange, until the secret police later bans this practice as unpatriotic. So German-themed beer halls like the Rhine's Gold are particularly popular, and Sorge is frequently spotted there in the late hours, visibly drunk and mingling with embassy associates. Tokyo offers a variety of restaurants, from upscale places with geishas to more modest venues with easier-going women. Sorge spends many nights out, drinking heavily and seeking female companionship. Eventually, he becomes involved with a regular girlfriend, Hanako, a waitress at the Rhine's Gold, and she becomes his lover. And Sorge decides to help her move forward in life, and he asks her what she'd like to do. Then he pays for her language studies to help her out. Hanako remains devoted to Sorge without knowing his true identity, staying loyal to him over the years. After the war, she would often speak fondly of him, saying, "I knew he wasn't in love with me, but he was always so kind." While she herself had fallen deeply in love, yet despite this affection and loyalty, Sorge faces an underlying issue in his position, the strain of concealing his double life, which limits the depth of his connections and keeps even his closest relationships at a distance, the double life of a spy. Heavy drinking brings its own risks, and Dr. Sorge indulges heavily, often loudly, sometimes even turning brutal. His behavior begins to alienate the small European community in Tokyo, especially the wives who once invited him into their homes. Although he maintains his connections with their husbands, he gradually stops receiving dinner invitations as his drunken outbursts become increasingly unpleasant. For a man of his intellect and standing, such a weakness is surprising. But the strain of his double life appears to demand an outlet, and for Sorge, that release is alcohol. One woman who had known him as a young romantic idealist in Berlin meets him again in Tokyo in the 1930s. So she reflects, "I'd known him as a romantic, idealistic student, but his cheekbones and mouth were sunken. His nose had grown sharp. He was completely changed. Not long after, he changes even more, taking up another risky habit, wild motorcycle rides. He buys a bike from Max Clausen, and by night, after drinking, Sorge races recklessly through the streets of Tokyo. After a night of heavy drinking, Sorge crashes his motorcycle into a wall on the American embassy in Tokyo. Japanese police arrive, and he manages to ask them to call his friend Max Clausen, who takes him to the hospital. Before heading there, Clausen is handed Sorge's house keys, as Sorge is a prominent German citizen and the embassy will likely secure his residence. Clausen gets there before the embassy staff, ensuring non-compromising documents are left behind. Sorge passes out just after handing over the keys. That's a huge risk. When he regains consciousness in the hospital, he is with a broken jaw and missing teeth, and an acquaintance remarks that the scars on his face will make him resemble as a Japanese kabuki mask, giving him a nearly demonic expression. Until now, I haven't gone into the details about the information Sorge provided to Moscow during those years, but as I mentioned, if there is one spy network that influenced the course of World War II, it's Sorge's. When he first arrived, the Soviet Union's primary concern was obtaining intelligence on Japan and its political landscape. However, while Sorge was in Tokyo, a significant development unfolded: the formation of an alliance between Germany and Japan. This alliance, which came to be known as the Anti-Comintern Pact, was explicitly aimed against the Soviet Union. The negotiations for this pact were conducted in utmost secrecy, to the extent that even the German Foreign Ministry was kept in the dark. The talks were personally handled by the Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop, with neither his ministry nor the German embassy in Tokyo aware of the discussions. At a certain point, Ambassador Ott catches wind of these secret negotiations and decides to write to Berlin, asking, "Could you please explain if we're really forming an alliance with Japan?" But the news is too big to keep quiet, so Ott shares it with his close friend, Dr. Sorge. He even has Sorge help decode the dispatch to Berlin, seeking details about the negotiations. And when Berlin replies, Moscow ends up learning about the alliance almost as soon as the German Foreign Ministry itself, a major intelligence breakthrough for the Soviets. Moscow, however, is particularly interested in the intentions of the Kwantung Army, Japan. Both political and militarily must expand to avoid economic suffocation, but in which direction? North against the Soviet Union, into China, or perhaps against American, British, or French colonies in the Pacific? Even within Japan opinions are divided, because with the Kwantung Army pushing strongly for a northern advance against the Soviet Union, right at this time, as mentioned, Ozaki, Sorge's trusted associate, becomes a consultant for the South Manchurian Railway. Through his role, he gains direct access to the Kwantung Army plans, and including sensitive documents revealing everything the Kwantung Army knows about the Soviet forces in Siberia and Mongolia. At a certain point, the Kwantung Army decides to act. Convinced the Soviet forces in the region are weak, they believe that if Japan invades Mongolia, a communist country with Soviet protection, they'll encounter little resistance. They have detailed intelligence on Soviet troop movements in the area. What they don't realize, however, is that Sorge has already informed Moscow of their plans. As a result, the Soviets have been able to completely realign their forces in the region. Through his Japanese contacts, Sorge has managed to send Moscow the full organizational chart of the Kwantung Army. The outcome is significant. In December of 1939, the Kwantung Army, without even informing the Japanese government, decides to test their theory by launching an incursion into Mongolia. Not with a small force, but with an entire army made up of several divisions that push deep into Mongolian territory. What follows is an intense but undeclared conflict, a secret war that all parties agreed to keep hidden from the world, leaving the international community completely unaware of these events. It's August 1939, and the world's attention is elsewhere, as World War II is about to erupt, with Hitler preparing to invade Poland. Meanwhile, in Mongolia, Japanese forces advance, unaware that the Soviet troops are fully informed of their plans, thanks to Sorge's intelligence, and have strategically repositioned themselves to counter the assault. Commanding the Soviet forces is General Zhukov, a figure that will become legendary for his role in taking Berlin 6 years down the line. At this moment, however, Zhukov remains largely unknown, and his actions in the secret war will go unreported to the outside world. In this hidden conflict, Zhukov decisively outmaneuvers the Japanese forces in Mongolia, encircling and annihilating them. Following this defeat, the Kwantung Army reconsiders its stance on waging war against the Soviet Union, opting instead to redirect its ambitions toward China and other targets. This defeat marks a turning point because Japan loses its appetite for conflict with the USSR. Yet while Japan withdraws from Soviet confrontation, Hitler will soon do the opposite, launching an invasion against the Soviet Union in June 1941. Sorge had warned Moscow of the impending Nazi invasion at least a month in advance. This piece of intelligence is one of the most controversial aspects of Sorge's entire service to the Soviet Union. Stalin had received multiple alerts, not just from Sorge, but through other sources as well, including German communist soldiers defecting and crossing the Soviet border to warn that Operation Barbarossa was imminent. However, Stalin, deeply anxious about a war he knew the Soviet Union was not yet ready for, refused to believe it. Thus, Sorge's potentially crucial warning went unheeded, with devastating consequences. When Operation Barbarossa was finally launched, the Wehrmacht broke through Soviet defenses with brutal speed. Sorge's lover, Hanako, later recounted that she saw him cry only once, the day Germany attacked the Soviet Union. When she asked him why he was so devastated, Sorge replied, "Because I am alone." But the situation is not over yet. As Germany continues its rapid advance into the Soviet Union, heading toward Moscow, it becomes crucial to know whether the Japanese have reconsidered their position and plan to attack from Siberia as well. In Japan, intense discussions are taking place. The Navy wants to focus on attacking the United States fleet at Pearl Harbor and French colonies in Indochina. The Army, on the other hand, wants to continue its invasion of China. The Kwantung Army, which had previously been a strong proponent of attacking the Soviet Union, lost its influence after its failure in Mongolia and no longer held the political power it once did within Japan's military leadership. During the summer and fall of 1941, Japanese government circles are in turmoil. In these circles moves a man who is well connected and whose opinion is sought after by everyone: Ozaki. Ozaki provides crucial information to Sorge, allowing him to report to Moscow that Japan has finally decided to focus its efforts on the Pacific. They will attack Pearl Harbor, leaving Siberia safe. This allows Stalin to withdraw his troops from the Far East and shift them to the west, just in time to halt the German advance before Moscow in December of 1941. In reality, there is more to the story. When Japanese prosecutors later interrogate Ozaki, they realize that his role went beyond merely sending information to Moscow. Ozaki was an influential man, a government advisor, and he played a part in shaping the decisions made during the highly confidential discussions he participated in. Ozaki insisted, "Attacking the Soviet Union is dangerous. It's not worth it. It's much better to attack the Americans." The Japanese prosecutors who interrogated him after his arrest are shocked and almost get the impression that Japan's war against America wasn't exactly provoked. Rather, they believe that the communists helped lead things in that direction. The Japanese prosecutors are horrified by the thought of what the country would say if it knew that this deadly war we got involved in. Well, the communists led us by the nose and made us do what they wanted. In fact, the Japanese prosecutors later tell the Americans after the war, we refrained from investigating this aspect further because we feared that a revolution might break out in the country if it were ever revealed. At this point, Sorge has the clear feeling that his mission is over. The Nazis are invading the Soviet Union and the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor hasn't happened yet, but his fate is already sealed. On October 15, 1941, Sorge sends a message to Moscow asking if they think it will be more useful for him and Max Clausen to be transferred to another country, perhaps Germany, since they are both German and could be very useful there. On the same day, Ozaki is arrested, and 3 days later, Sorge is taken into custody. Clausen and the others follow suit. Sorge's network falls almost by chance. The network was so vast that the Japanese were bound to find a lead eventually. However, they discovered it by chance and took them a long time to track it down. 2 years earlier, in November 1939, the Japanese secret police, the Toko, had arrested a member of the underground Communist Party, whom they detained and tortured. He was forced to give names, more names of communists, and he named a woman, a certain Mrs. Kitabayashi. She had emigrated to America, lived in Los Angeles, and then returned to Japan. She was a communist. The Toko began surveillance on this elderly woman and her husband, an elderly couple, watching them for 2 years in the hope of uncovering something significant. Yet they found nothing. After 2 years, they grew tired and arrested them. This brings us to the fall of 1941. Mrs. Kitabayashi is arrested, and they tell her, now you need to give us the names of the other communists. She tries to remember and recalls that when she was in California, she knew a Japanese communist named Miyagi. The Japanese secret police have never heard of this Miyagi, but they go after him anyways. Miyagi was the first Japanese person that Sorge had recruited into his network. They find him and bring him to the police station. While being tortured, Miyagi throws himself out of a window at the police station. These things happen in every country, as you can see. He doesn't succeed in killing himself, and he breaks his leg. They go after him, bring him back, and take him inside again. The next day, he starts naming people. He implicates Sorge, Ozaki, and Max Clausen. Perhaps without this, Sorge wouldn't have lasted as long. In fact, it later emerged that from the Berlin archives that in 1940, the Nazi Party, in their efforts to dig throughout old paperwork, had found information indicating that Sorge had been a communist in his youth, which made them suspicious at that point. Walter Schellenberg was a high-ranking officer in Nazi Germany's SS, the Schutzstaffel, and the head of its foreign intelligence branch, responsible for espionage and gathering intelligence outside Germany. He had gathered information suggesting that Sorge was an incredibly valuable man, a loyal Nazi, and a close friend of the ambassador, Ambassador Ott. Schellenberg believed that Sorge was crucial to their operations and, as a result, advised, no, leave Sorge alone. Schellenberg has also told Ambassador Ott, who was a close friend of Sorge, the foreign intelligence within the Reich main security office is keeping an eye on things without getting directly involved or naming people or naming names, but be sure to watch the people around him. Ambassador Ott, a mall at the embassy, is at the embassy, but keep this to yourself and only sharing it. What he did after Schellenberg informed Ott There may be a mole in the embassy. So what does Ott do? He goes and tells to his close friend, Dr. Sorge. The Germans trusted Sorge so much that when the Japanese secret police went to arrest him, the first thing that happened was the German embassy officially protested the arrest of such an illustrious member of the German community in Tokyo. Ambassador Ott even visited him in prison. For a long time, the German embassy put pressure to have Sorge released, insisting that it must have been a mistake. As for the Japanese public, from what little they learned from the newspapers, they became convinced that Sorge was arrested as a German spy, since, of course, even allies spy on each other. In short, the Germans trusted Sorge completely, as he himself once said, "I believe I can lead them all by the nose." When the real truth eventually came to light in Berlin, Schellenberg was summoned by his superior, Heinrich Himmler, and as he later said, had a very unpleasant conversation with him. Sorge and Ozaki were arrested and put on trial, a lengthy, meticulous process that lasted for years. During this time, they wrote many memorandums and to explain their positions, all of which exist and have been studied. It's a remarkable story in its own right. One question that immediately arises, of course, is whether they were tortured. It's not easy to answer because Japan was a very strange country. The military police were ruthless and known for torturing people mercilessly. The Japanese secret police, the Toko, did torture people, but they were more careful about it. With high-profile foreigners in particular, they were treated differently. What is truly astonishing is that the judiciary in Japan was independent and very serious about upholding the law. For 3 years, the Japanese judiciary interrogated Sorge and Ozaki with extreme politeness and attention, carefully documented all their statements with great formality. It seems likely that neither Sorge nor Ozaki were tortured, although some of their agents may have been, as many of them died in prison. Hanako, Sorge's lover, visits him at the police station and quickly decides that she doesn't understand anything about politics. So gender roles at that time were really bad. So they thought that she didn't know anything because she was a woman, and as a result, she's seen as innocent and uninvolved. So they leave her alone. So Sorge remains in prison for years, during which he has some meetings, initially with Ambassador Ott, though it is assumed that Ott eventually stopped visiting him. Hanako, who visits Sorge regularly and receives newspapers, is able to keep track of the progress of the war. The man who had wept the day the Germans attacked the Soviet Union is eventually General Paulus' army at Stalingrad. On that day, he was seen dancing for joy in his cell. After 3 years, the judges and prosecutors, an entire team who had interrogated them, finally reach a verdict. Sorge and Ozaki are sentenced to death. They are the only ones to receive the sentence. The others are sentenced to long prison terms, but a few months later, when the Americans enter Tokyo, they open the prison doors. Those who are still alive are released. Max Clausen avoided the death penalty partly because he was the only one who had given a statement to the Japanese prosecutor, claiming that he had come to Japan thinking it was a country hostile to workers, but had been mistaken. Japan is the most sincere and people-friendly government I have ever known. He talks his way out of it. Such statement pleased the Japanese. Max Clausen was not sentenced to death and was released by the Americans. He later moved with his wife to East Germany. Sorge and Ozaki were hanged on November 7, 1944. Despite their long and grueling interrogations, the prosecutors who questioned them for months and years left extremely respectful testimonies. The Tokyo officials who had interrogated Ozaki for 5 months wrote in the report that he had agreed to collaborate with Sorge because he considered it an honorable mission. Japan is a strange place, a strange country. While in other places, someone involved in such a situation would be considered a traitor and reviled, the Japanese admire those who die for their own beliefs. After Sorge's execution in 1944, Hanako compiled and published the love letters Sorge had written to her while he was in prison. The book is titled Koto no Yume, A Dream of the Higher Order, that was published in the post-war years and became a bestseller in Japan. It highlighted the deep personal relationships between Sorge and Hanako during his final years. As for Richard Sorge, or Ika, as his friends called him, he continued to be the man who was liked by everyone until the very end. Prosecutor Yoshikawa, who had conducted his interrogation, declared, "In my entire life, I have never met a man of such stature." So this is the story of Richard Sorge, or Ika. As you can see, there is a lot of deception involved. He was able to fool actually two countries, Japan and Germany, in order to carry the interest of Russia, and he succeeded to a certain extent. However, for how long can you do that? And that's incredible. One curious story that is funny and entertaining for me at the same time is how Max Clausen, from a proletariat, a communist, he actually became a business owner, and he actually really tasted with reality the power of capitalism when he was making profit, and he was forced to share it in order to support the cause of the communist agenda. He actually was a little bit resentful to let go of that hard-earned money, and there's something that teaches you something, that those who want communism actually do not know how it works because they haven't lived it in reality. And no matter how many generations will come and say this time will be different, it will really not. So that is something interesting. However, what can we say about this character? He was a charming character. So he had a lot of emotional intelligence. He most likely would be able to read people and be liked, and that's how he was able to make so many powerful friends and carve his way in the highest echelons of the German society and also the Japanese society. But that took a toll on his life, having a double life, the drinking, the alcohol, that were parts that made him a little bit unstable and a little bit more unpredictable. However, history is strange, and somehow it seems like eventually everything you do catches up with you. So I just want to leave you with this. And well, if you made it this far, it was very long. It was great. It was really entertaining. I really enjoyed it, even retelling it. And drop a like and subscribe. And I will see you next time, ladies and gents. Bye.